Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
It's a privilege to be here with you this morning and be in your presence. It's always a privilege for me to be here. I live in Tacoma, Washington. So I'm always very grateful when I can get here. I'm always honored to be asked to give a student talk. And and of course, I'm always somewhat terrified by it. Because after all, what can I say? I'm not a teacher, and I certainly don't make any claims to know any secrets. One of the things that drew me to Sonoma Mountain 25 years ago was that no one here tried to sell me anything. It was just, here is what we do. Here is this practice. You test it. You test it for yourself. And for me, I think also the fact that it was physical. I had to do it. It really was just sort of like, just sit down and be quiet. Just kind of like that. And the other thing about it is no one claimed to know the truth. They lived by, a principle that's expressed in the Diamond Sutra, that truth is undeclarable. And the enunciation of truth is just a name. You might say that the only attempt here to express truth is the sound of the banjo. The other thing is that I need to say that the process of preparing for these talks is daunting for me. It's difficult. I have to go through a self-examination every time. And the reason for that is multiple, but one of the important reasons is that I have a tendency to intellectualize everything. As a way to hide out, if you will. I remember in a talk a month or so ago, Nyose made the comment that when we come into the Zendo, we neither arrive nor do we hide. So I'm grateful for the ability to practice and to have the privilege to practice when there are millions of people in the world that in their life will never have this opportunity. I also want to express my deep gratitude and thanks to Roshi, my teacher of 25 years. And Shinko, And of course, my love and respect for Nyose and Cashin and those who hold this place. And I want to say thank you to the Sangha, the community that has sustained Sonoma Mountain through thick and thin, through good times and hard times. I'm very grateful for that. So now with all that said, I'll try to lead you through, a kind of a tunnel, and I hope I get us through the end of it. Many years ago, I had been coming here on weekends for a few months. I used to live just about 45 minutes away. I lived over in the valley. And I would come over on the weekends and sit in the evening and stay overnight, do the morning sit and program. And I did that for a little while, and maybe one session. And not knowing why really I was coming, and I just followed what others did. And I remember reading a long time ago, Thomas Merton once said that Zen masters don't teach, they point. And I've been watching Roshi point for 25 years, Anyway, one day in Sesshin, it was perhaps the first or the second time actually that I was in Dokusan, and those of you who don't know what that is, Dokusan is a personal interview with the teacher, very intimate. And for me it was strange, it was very awkward, weird. I said, what am I doing here? I'm doing these prostrations here and this, and anyway, I was curious, and I asked Roshi, what is this thing that people wear? What is this little apron that they have on? What is this thing? The Raksu. And there was a little touch of frustration in his voice. And he said, well, this is not about being a Buddhist. This is about freedom. And that's always been with me over the years, and today I'd like to explore with you this freedom to which Roshi referred way back then. And I'll talk about this as if I understand it. So, I'll just say that as a caveat here. What did he mean all those years ago? What is freedom? What does this practice have to do with freedom anyway? Assuming we can define it. First, we need to say freedom is a word. It's language. And in a certain way, all language is a metaphor. In other words, freedom is not the thing itself. And of course, it's a complex of ideas all created in the mind, then projected and assumed to be real. An abstract concept, and it's the subject of endless conjecture, discussion, connotation, interpretation. It's a word with different definitions and, of course, great misunderstanding. It's also a word that carries great emotion. You know, a word for which untold numbers of people in history have died. So what are some of the definitions? Well, one is free from the state of being physically enslaved. You know, the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Being emancipated. Another is a state of not being subject to or affected by any particular undesirable thing that you want. And, you know, in a political sense, an oppressive government and so forth. Here we're talking about a freedom that I think we express as a personal or spiritual liberation or release or personal emancipation. And a very touching, very good expression of the human longing for this freedom, I think, is in the first 3 lines of Leonard Cohen's classic song, Bird on a Wire. Like a bird on a wire, like a drunk in the midnight choir, I have tried in my way to be free. So then the question becomes, well, freedom from what, you know? In the Okesa, the donning the Okesa verse, which is, we chant every morning, and the first lines are, limitless is the robe of liberation. You know, a formless field of benefaction. And in the Heart Sutra, the very opening of the Heart Sutra says this: Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, practicing deep prajna paramita, clearly saw that all 5 conditions are empty, and thus was relieved from all suffering and fear. Relieved. Relieved of all suffering. Fear indeed, right? Fear. Fear is pushed and promoted every day in our lives. Politicians, of course, promote fear. My neighborhood website, I look at, all my neighbors promote fear. You know, look out on the website, it says on the listserv, the neighbor down the street will say, look out for the homeless person that's wandering in the neighborhood. Be sure you close your garage door. And fear is sold to us. Do you have the newest video cam on your front porch in your security system? Now, I'm not saying that there's not a role for fear. That there certainly would be, but but it's there. This is it. So, just a question, do you worry a lot? Do you worry about things in your life? I do. And it's always been a source of frustration and angst in my life. I worry about my family, all of it. I worry about, am I good enough? Have I done a good enough job? Am I, you name it, I can worry about it. And I think that this constant angst, this worry, arises from fear. So this subject brought me to go back and look at Trungpa Rinpoche's book, The Myth of Freedom and the Way of Meditation. This is a fascinating, in his style, the way he presented his ideas is gripping, really. And in this, he explores the idea of freedom in the context of this practice. And he sees freedom as as generally thought of as the ability to achieve goals and satisfy desires. But what are the sources of these goals? Through practice, we come to see that the sources of the goals they arise from our greed, our clinging, or pushing away what we don't want, anger, and ignorance. And that makes foundational the idea of the other. That the other is real. That this duality this duality I live in is real. Or said in another way, seeing the self as separate and not interdependent. Leads to habitual patterns of clinging and aversion. So is it the freedom to pursue goals? Is that true freedom? Or is it just a myth? And Trungpa says this idea, this sense of freedom is a myth. And what I've come to understand, and to be honest, only recently, after all these years, that for me, it is a freedom from fear that I long for. Well, fear of what? What am I afraid of? Change. Afraid of change. So my resistance seemingly that, it somehow seems to be always present, this resistance. It causes me to run away from the fact of impermanence. Only if I could be a good enough person. A good enough father, husband, brother, friend. If I could only be successful enough in life, whatever that is. Better said, if I could just build a solid wall of physical, emotional, and psychological security, then I wouldn't have to face the music. That transience, uncertainty, and mystery is as it is. So I'd like to just give you a quick example of how this happens in my life. About a year and a half ago, 2 years ago now maybe, my brother-in-law, who I loved for 50 years, passed away, and it was very difficult for me emotionally. And he had suffered from Alzheimer's for quite a while. And I thought I had, in the process of dealing with that, sort of come to face this transience in life, with courage, stand there and be tough. And then today is my my son's 49th birthday, Daniel. And about a month, in August, I was down in California, and he lives in Chelan, Washington. And he ended up in hospital with a heart issue. And he was in for tests, they were testing him. And when I talked to Karen, to my wife, about it on the phone, I literally came apart. The idea that someone that close could go. And of course, it turned out fine. It was fine. But I was a wreck. And what it did, of course, is make me even more grateful. There's a little chapter in Trungpa's in the Myth of Freedom called The Cosmic Joke. That's Trungpa for you, the cosmic joke. It's the joke that I am who I think I am. It really is. It's a whole narrative, a whole description of how the ego, through its, endless resources, if you will, creates a self-imprisonment. It literally puts me in jail. And try to give you a little example of this. The poet Jane Hirschfield once wrote, "We are different from one another, and moment by moment, even from ourselves." And I'd like to tell you a little story. I have an 8-year-old granddaughter. Have 2 grandsons. One is like 26 years old and the other 24. And lo and behold, I have an 8-year-old granddaughter and 2 great-grandchildren. So my granddaughter lives in Los Angeles, and my daughter and her husband made the decision to put her in Catholic school, which you can imagine in our house was a subject of a lot of discussion, you know. And Charlotte is, she's just a treat, you know. But anyway, she came home from school one day and she was talking with her mom about the subject about Jesus. Jesus came up. We're talking about Jesus. And my daughter and her mom said, well, Charlotte, you know, when did Jesus live? And Charlotte instantly said, well, in the 1980s, Mom, when you were a kid. You know? She lived in the 80s, and Heather later said, well, Charlotte defines all history in the 1980s. You know? But it's a, you know, it's kind of a lesson, you know. Her reality was that. And in the, you know, the Lankavatara Sutra says, because the projections of people's minds appear before them as objects, they become attached to their existence. By becoming aware that their projections are nothing but mind, they transform and finally see for themselves what Buddhas see. Well, where do we go next with this discussion about freedom? I think we talked very briefly about the Four Noble Truths. So the first is life is suffering. And, you know, there's the obvious that from the Buddhist story and that the suffering of birth, growing old, illness, dying. But there's also the suffering that comes from the anxiety or stress of trying to hold on to things that are constantly changing. And believe me, I suffer with it. The second truth is that there's a cause for this suffering. It has an origin. And it's in our craving, you know, it's in that greed, anger, and ignorance. It's in the, you know, the middle of the wheel. And the you know, a craving, and it includes this craving that to be solid or permanent, be ongoing, you know, and to be in the past and future. You see things you can't. You know, it doesn't make sense. The craving to prevail and dominate over others. You know, it goes. You can talk about a lot of stuff. And then also maybe a craving to not be. That is to not experience the world. To push away the world, to push away painful feeling. And I think on a deeper level it refers to the misunderstanding of the nature of self and reality itself. I mentioned that wall that I always think I'm trying to build. Trungpa said that through this practice, you have to take that wall down brick by brick. And I've been pulling bricks for 25 years, The third noble truth is that there is a cessation of suffering. And in this tradition, it is through Zazen, the practice that seeps into your daily life. It's physical, plain, direct simplicity. In its practical approach, and it will help. It is the realization of emptiness that all things, as the Heart Sutra tells us, are empty of a separate self. And it's a physical practice of humility, tact, and it's based in a dignified posture and respect for breath. And it forces me to face life. And I think it faces the world in a world that has great over-certainty. If that makes any sense. Over-certainty in the world, that I was, that was put in my memory bank when I was a kid, certainty. And of course the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path. But this discussion of fear, I think, needs to center in the Heart Sutra on the teaching. Thich Nhat Hanh, I heard once say, the Heart Sutra is a teaching about fear. And what's so interesting for me is I've been doing this all these years. I heard that 15 or 20 years ago, and I didn't hear it. I didn't hear it. And what does it say? It says, Avalokiteshvara clearly saw that all five conditions are empty and thus was relieved from suffering and fear. So what are those five conditions? Form, sensation, perception, discrimination, consciousness. All empty of a separate self. What it says is they do not exist independently. And I started thinking about this, and I thought, it's saying that my very awareness of my own consciousness is empty of a separate self. My own consciousness is totally interdependent with everything I experience. And of course, the Heart Sutra goes on and presents great paradox. And in doing that, it's honest. So what is the point of practice? Why do this? Why even do this? I have practiced for many years, thinking that in some way, that at some point, I might reach a destination. I might reach a goal. There'll be a place I come to in my life that would give me an answer to the mystery of what. But I've learned that there is nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go. Roshi said, what it really comes down to is the wisdom and compassion of non-avoidance. You just keep going. And as you do, working with the practice called compassion breath, you know how to transmute what you hear, smell, taste, touch, and think every day. And he also said, with practice, this process helps you learn to be kind to yourself and to all beings as well. So I'd like to tell you a little story. I'm going to come to an end of this pretty quick. But a little story about my younger grandson. He's now 22 years old, I guess. But when he was 6 years old, and some of you have heard this before maybe, but we live in up by Seattle. And I took Aiden and his brother to the REI flagship store. Now REI is a dangerous place to go. You can spend a lot of money there real fast. And at their flagship store, they have a big framed glass entrance with about a 50-foot climbing wall. Big climbing wall. And the two boys wanted to climb the wall. And of course there's a attendant and there's a belay and there's all the harness and there's all the stuff. And Aiden is 6 years old and he starts climbing the wall. And he keeps climbing the wall. And he keeps climbing the wall. Next thing you know, he's up there about 40 feet, hanging on. And he just looks down and he goes, "Pop, I'm done. I'm done." And I said, Well, just let go, Aiden. And in this situation, if you let go and push away, you fly. And the young woman that was on the belay, she said, Aiden, you're safer there than you are in your car. But his mind, of course, wouldn't let him turn loose of that wall, right? And, of course, he did finally. So, I'm beginning to see, after all these years, that the freedom that Roshi referred to in Dokusanda many years ago is exactly the freedom that comes from understanding that there is nowhere to go. That practice is living life in this great mystery. And as I said to my 6-year-old, just let go, Need to teach myself. And it's in Zazen, and it's seepage into my daily life, I might say. That helps with this, slow freedom from fear that comes from that I deal with all the time with my struggle against impermanence and change and fear of change. I've found no other way. And also, just to be clear, this doesn't mean that I'm free from grief and sorrow. And I don't think that the Dharma claims, I don't think there's a claim that through practice I'll ever come to some point where I'll not experience grief or sorrow. It's part of life. Part of the stream. Part of the stream. Another thing, and I came across this in reading a little bit of R.H. Blyth. So for those of you who don't know who he is, a British scholar who was a Japanese prisoner of war in China during World War II and scholar of haiku poetry. And he once wrote that freedom from that, and I'm paraphrasing this now, freedom from the feeling that happiness is an end in itself is a long task. Freedom is freedom from the long ago implanted notion that I have a right to certain things, chiefly a right to be happy. That's not as it is, in my experience. There will always be joy, happiness, grief, sadness, fulfillment, and despair. As I live in the stream, This practice has helped me come to as it is. Come to as it is. And it's said in Zen that when you try to speak it, you instantly lose it. it's gone. As soon as you start to articulate it, it's gone. It's like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, of the Diamond Sutra, the exclamation of truth is just a name. So with that, I want to close with a little poem. This is from the beat poet Lou Welch. It's called I Saw Myself. I saw myself, a ring of bone, in the clear stream of it all, and vowed to always be open to it, that all of it might flow through, and then heard ring of bone, where ring is what a bell does.